All right, everyone. Welcome back for another deep dive.
Yes.
And today we're going to be talking about
Noise
noise at
for
work.
work.
So we're going to be kind of aiming this at people who work in environmental health
Yes.
or are thinking about going into environmental health.
Yes.
So that means we're going to be focusing mainly on UK legislation.
Yeah.
So the two main sources that we're going to be using today are the Control of Noise at Work Regulations, 2005, and then also the HSE's guidance document, L108, Controlling Noise at Work.
Okay.
So we're going to be looking at those. And the main reason that we're doing all of this is because we're trying to prevent noise-induced hearing loss.
Yes.
Which is a big problem in workplace.
Yeah, it's a huge problem. It's completely preventable.
Yes.
Which is the good news.
Yeah.
So these regulations and this guidance that we're going to go through are giving us that framework for being able to identify, assess, and mitigate the risks.
Yes.
So we can prevent it.
So why don't we start with that first document, the Control of Noise at Work Regulations, 2005.
Okay.
So these regulations came into effect on the 6th of April, 2006.
Right.
But there were some later dates for things like music and entertainment sectors, and also seagoing ships.
Yes. Industries that probably needed a little bit longer to be able to adapt to the practicalities of the regulations.
Yeah, I imagine it takes quite a bit more work to adapt a concert hall to these regulations than, say, an office or something like that.
Yeah, absolutely. Imagine retrofitting a historic music venue with sound dampening materials, for example.
Yeah.
Or updating a massive cargo ship.
Yeah, so, and speaking of ships, there's one fascinating exception in these regulations.
What's that?
And that's that the master and crew of seagoing ships are actually exempt from some of the regulations around noise control.
I suppose considering the nature of the work and the constant sort of hum and noise that's going on, that there are going to be certain risks that are just unavoidable. So it's probably a recognition of the inherent challenges.
Yeah.
But of course, it doesn't mean that there isn't any effort made to try and protect their hearing.
Of course.
And the regulations still say that they've got to take reasonable steps to try and minimize the risks.
Yes. Okay, so the regulations also go on to define the enforcing authority. Yeah. And that's where you guys come in.
That's right.
So it's basically a joint effort between a few different organizations.
Yeah.
So we've got the HSE. Yeah. We've got local authorities, the Office for Nuclear Regulation.
Yes.
And the Office of Rail and Road. So those all have jurisdiction over different sectors.
Yeah.
But environmental health officers are often the ones who are sort of on the front lines.
Yes.
Making sure that these regulations are being followed.
Absolutely. And for those of you who are still studying,
yes,
this is a taste of what's to come.
Yeah, so now that we've got that out of the way, why don't we get into the real meat of it?
Okay.
And that is the exposure action values and the exposure limit values.
Okay.
So these are super important for anyone who is involved in noise control.
Yeah, they're really key. And you can think of it a bit like a tiered system of protection for workers' hearing.
Okay.
So the lower action value, that's kind of our first trigger point. So once someone's daily or weekly exposure hits that level, that's when it becomes mandatory to do a risk assessment.
Okay.
And then if that exposure goes above the upper action value, then we need to put a formal noise control program in place.
Okay.
But also we need to provide hearing protection.
Right. And so this is all related to the concept of noise dose as well.
Yeah.
Isn't it?
It is. It's not just about how loud the sound is, but how long someone's exposed to it.
Yeah.
So you can kind of think of it like a bank account
Yeah.
for noise exposure. So
Right.
every task they do throughout the day that's noisy, that's kind of adding to their balance.
Right.
And if we exceed those action values, then we're potentially putting those workers at risk.
Yes. And the guidance document actually gives us some really good sort of relatable examples that can help us to understand what levels we're talking about.
Yeah.
So, for instance, if you have to shout to be heard 2 meters away,
Yes.
then that is a clear sign that a noise risk assessment is needed.
Yeah. It's a simple but really effective way of gauging whether that noise level is potentially harmful or not.
Okay. So we've established when action needs to be taken.
Yes.
But what does that action actually look like?
Yeah.
So what strategies can employers use to actually control that noise in the workplace?
Well, L108 outlines something called a hierarchy of control measures.
Okay.
And it's something you'll want to be familiar with as environmental health officers. So elimination is the most effective strategy.
Yeah.
So that's getting rid of the noise source entirely.
Right.
But that's not always feasible, is it?
Right. You can't exactly eliminate the sound of a jackhammer on a building site or
No.
factory noise or something.
Exactly. So the next best thing then is substitution. So can we replace a piece of equipment that's particularly noisy
Right.
with a quieter model?
Yeah.
Or can we adjust the process to make it quieter?
So that's where those buy quiet policies come in then.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah, they encourage businesses to consider noise levels when they're buying new equipment.
Yeah.
And it's about preventing those problems in the first place.
Right.
And as an environmental health officer, you guys can advocate for those policies and really help businesses to make informed choices.
Yeah, I imagine it would be a win-win situation then.
Yeah.
Where you're protecting workers' hearing,
Absolutely.
but also potentially saving businesses money
Yeah.
in the long run because they don't have to go back and retrofit and that kind of thing.
Yeah, and for those of you who are studying,
Yeah.
think about how you can incorporate this knowledge into your future work.
Okay.
You know, could you develop a checklist for businesses
Yeah.
to use when they're procuring equipment?
Right.
Or maybe a presentation to give to local businesses on the benefits of Buy Quiet.
Okay, so let's say that elimination and substitution aren't an option.
Okay.
Or they're just not enough
Yeah.
to get the noise levels down to where they need to be.
Mm-hmm.
What next?
Then we've got to think about engineering controls.
Right.
So this is where we're modifying the workplace or the process
Okay.
to reduce the exposure.
So things like, I'm picturing like silencers
Yeah.
on things like air exhausts and that kind of
Yeah,
thing.
you got it. Silencers are a great example.
Mhm.
Really simple modification
Yeah.
can make a big difference.
Yeah.
Also, damping materials.
Okay.
So that can be used on vibrating surfaces to reduce the noise transmission.
Okay.
So imagine a saw blade with damping layers.
Right.
It's still going to cut through the wood,
Mm-hmm.
but it's going to do it much more quietly.
Okay, so those are good examples of how to control the noise at the source.
Yeah.
But what about the environment itself?
Yeah, good point.
So is there anything that we can do to reduce the noise as it travels through the workplace?
Yeah, workplace design plays a key role here.
Okay.
So you can segregate noisy processes.
Right.
You can create noise havens.
Okay.
And you can use things like barriers and screens
Yeah.
to block or absorb the sound.
Okay.
And L108 has some really good diagrams to show these different techniques.
So even the layout of, say, a factory
Yeah,
or an office or something can have an impact.
absolutely.
Okay.
Yeah, and think about the implications for you guys
Yeah.
as environmental health officers.
Mm-hmm.
When you're doing inspections,
Right.
you're not just looking at individual pieces of equipment. You're looking at the overall design of that workspace
Right.
and how that might be contributing
Yeah.
to noise exposure.
Okay. Now, I do have a question about those enclosures
Okay.
that they use sometimes to kind of contain noisy machinery.
Yeah.
Don't those get really stuffy?
Yeah, that's a good point.
Yeah, it seems like you'd be trading one problem for another.
Yeah, you need to make sure there's good ventilation and cooling in there.
Right.
So you're not creating a situation where people are uncomfortable or at risk of heat stress.
Right. Because at the end of the day, it's all about protecting the workers' health and safety.
Absolutely.
And speaking of protection, let's talk about hearing protection.
Okay.
So things like earmuffs and earplugs.
Yeah.
That seems like a pretty simple solution.
It does, doesn't it?
Yeah, just hand them out and you're done.
Yeah, but remember that hierarchy of controls.
Right.
Hearing protection should only be a last resort,
Okay.
not a primary solution.
So it's only used when other control measures have been exhausted.
Yeah, or as a supplemental measure
Oh.
in really high noise environments.
So it's kind of like putting a Band-Aid on a broken leg.
Yeah.
You know, it's just masking the problem temporarily. It's
Yeah.
not actually fixing it.
Exactly. And as environmental health officers, you'll be tasked with making sure that businesses aren't just relying on hearing protection
Right.
to comply with the regs.
So when hearing protection is necessary,
Yeah.
what are some of the things that we need to consider?
Well, first of all, you need to make sure it's appropriate
Okay.
for the type and level of noise exposure.
Right.
You know, different types of protection offer different levels of noise reduction.
Okay.
So it's important to choose wisely.
And proper fit is important, I imagine, as well.
Absolutely. A poorly fitted earplug or earmuff
Yeah.
is as good as useless.
Right.
Things like facial hair,
Oh, God.
glasses, the shape of someone's ear canal can all have an impact.
Right. So things that I wouldn't have even thought about.
Yeah, and L108 actually says that the HSE recommends adding 4 decibels
Right.
to the assumed protection level
Okay.
to account for these real-world factors.
That's interesting.
You know, like fit and usage.
Yeah.
So it's a good reminder that we can't just rely on theoretical values. We've got to be realistic
Yeah.
about how hearing protection performs in practice.
And that brings up another question, actually.
Yeah.
So what about jobs where noise exposure fluctuates a lot?
Oh, good point.
So how do you make sure that workers are adequately protected when the noise levels are constantly changing?
Well, that's where noise dosimeters come in.
Okay.
They're like little detectives
Right.
that can track the noise levels throughout the day.
So it gives a much better picture than just a single snapshot measurement.
Yeah, it's much more comprehensive.
Right.
So for those jobs where the noise isn't constant, a dosimeter is going to give you a much more accurate picture of someone's exposure over time.
So we've talked a lot about preventing noise-induced hearing loss.
We have.
But what happens when it's too late for prevention?
Yeah.
How do we detect and manage any damage that's already been done?
Well, that's where health surveillance comes in.
Okay.
So it's about detecting the early signs of hearing damage,
Right.
but also evaluating how effective our noise control program is.
So it's like a regular checkup for your ears.
Exactly.
To make sure everything is still working.
Yeah, and a key part of that is audiometric testing.
Okay.
So it's basically a hearing test.
Yeah.
But it's a lot more in-depth.
Right.
It measures hearing sensitivity across different frequencies.
So it's more in-depth than just a standard hearing test that you might get
Absolutely.
at the doctor's or something.
Yeah, and the regulations are very clear on this.
Okay.
If someone is exposed at or above those upper exposure action values, they have to have regular audiometric testing.
Okay.
And that's really important for catching any hearing loss early.
Right.
When it might be reversible.
So I imagine those audiograms give you guys a lot of information.
Yeah, they do. And, with the rise of digital audiometry, we can now analyze that data in really sophisticated ways.
Okay.
So we can track trends over time, identify patterns, even flag potential risks before they become a real problem.
So it's almost like having a crystal ball for hearing health.
It's getting close.
That's amazing.
Yeah, and this information can be really valuable, not only for informing our noise control strategies, but also demonstrating how effective they are.
Now, speaking of technology, what about things like noise monitoring apps and wearable sensors?
Good point.
I've seen those popping up everywhere.
Yeah.
Do you think those have a place in the future of noise control?
I think they have the potential to revolutionize how we approach noise monitoring and control.
Yeah.
They can give workers real-time feedback on the noise levels, which empowers them to make informed decisions.
And I imagine that's especially useful for workers who move around a lot.
Absolutely.
Like construction workers or delivery drivers or something.
Yeah, or people who are working in environments where the noise is fluctuating.
Right.
Unpredictably.
Okay.
And some of these apps even integrate with hearing protection.
Oh, wow.
So they can automatically adjust the level of noise cancellation based on the environment.
So it sounds like we're on the cusp of a new era in noise control.
I think you're right.
Where technology is playing a bigger and bigger part.
Yeah, and for those of you who are studying to become environmental health officers, this is something to keep in mind.
Right.
The tools and the technology that we use, they're constantly evolving. So it's important to stay informed, embrace innovation.
So as we wrap up this deep dive then, what are some key takeaways for our listeners?
I think the most important one is that noise control is a shared responsibility.
Okay.
It's not just up to the employers.
Right.
It's up to everyone who's involved. The workers, the supervisors, and of course, environmental health officers like yourselves.
It's a real team effort.
Absolutely. It requires good communication collaboration and a real commitment to protecting workers' health.
And remember, you don't have to go it alone.
That's right.
There are loads of reresources out there that can help you with your work.
Things like the HSE, the Institute of Acoustics, they've got guidance documents, training materials. They even offer expert advice. So don't hesitate to reach out.
Knowledge is power.
It is.
So speaking of knowledge, what are some key resources
that
you would recommend for people who want to learn more?
Well, L108 is a great starting point,
Okay.
as we've said. It's a really comprehensive guide. The HSE's website as well is a treasure trove of information on noise control.
Right.
Got case studies, guidance documents, even interactive tools.
And I imagine there's also industry-specific resources as well.
Absolutely.
For people working in more specialized sectors.
Yeah, for example, CIO,
Right.
the Construction Industry Research and Information Association. They've published a lot of good stuff on noise control in the construction industry. And if
Great.
you're interested in music and entertainment,
Yeah.
you've got the Music Venue Trust.
Okay.
They provide support to music venues across the UK.
So as we come to the end of our deep dive into the world of noise control then,
Yes.
what's the one thing that you want our listeners to take away from this conversation?
I want them to remember that protecting workers' hearing isn't just a legal obligation.
Right.
It's a moral imperative as well.
Yeah.
And by taking proactive steps to control noise, we can prevent that irreversible hearing damage and create safer and healthier workplaces for everyone.
Well said. And remember, if you're leaving work with ringing in your ears, that's a sign that the noise levels might be a bit too high.
That's right. Pay attention to your body.
Yeah.
And if you have any concerns, don't hesitate to speak up.
So on that note, let's leave our listeners with a final thought. What role can we all play in creating a future where noise-induced hearing loss is a thing of the past?
That's a great question.
It's a big challenge, but I think that through collaboration and innovation and commitment to worker well-being,
Absolutely.
we can make a real difference.
I agree.
So thanks for joining us on this deep dive.
Thanks, everyone.